Hello, I'm Mark Salmon. I'm one of the sailors on the Kathleen. The Kathleen is part of the historic vessels collection of the National Maritime Museum, and it was built by a fellow named Jack Earl and his wife Kathleen Gillett during the early to late 1930s and completed just before the Second World War. Jack then competed in the first Sydney to Hobart yacht race and made the second ever circumnavigation by a small Australian yacht. We're really lucky to be able to sail the Kathleen, and the purpose of this video is to introduce you to her, to describe some of her idiosyncrasies, and to make sure that you have a safe and enjoyable sail.
The first thing to know is that when we sail on the Kathleen, we have to abide by general museum policies about what we can and can't do on board the vessel. There are three main things to remember. The first is that we cannot have or consume any drugs or alcohol on board. The second is that the Kathleen is a non-smoking vessel, just like the rest of the museum. And finally, if we create any rubbish or garbage, it must be taken off the boat when we leave it.
We're in the forward cabin now, and here's where we store the head sails. And we have a staysail, which is labelled staysail, and a jib. These two sail bags here. And then just ahead of those, we have the sheets used for those two sails, together with the blocks. And all of these, of course, will need to be taken on deck to be hoisted. Also in the forward cabin, on the starboard side, we have a fire extinguisher. There are two on the boat, and we'll show you the other one later. Just behind the ladder to the forward cabin, we have the storage area for portable flotation devices, PFDs we call them. Whenever you're operating or sailing on board the Kathleen, you must wear one of these jackets. It's mandatory. We also have a number of non-inflating PFDs, which are stored in another part of the boat, and they're used for passengers should an emergency occur. But remember, whenever you're sailing on the Kathleen, you must wear one of these PFDs. So one of the things we have to do before leaving on the Kathleen is to do our basic engine checks. And to access the engine and the batteries, we really need to bring up the companionway ladder and secure it on either side. To access the engine to do the necessary checks, we lift up the covers. The auxiliary power for the Kathleen is provided by this 4-cylinder diesel engine. It's quite an old engine, so it's a bit cantankerous and needs to be looked after carefully. There are three really important checks we need to do of the engine before we leave the berth. And they're all listed on this checklist up above the engine. So you don't need to remember them, but you need to follow that checklist when you are doing engine checks. The first check we need to do is checking the level of the coolant. And you do that by opening the coolant filling port, this one here, and checking to make sure that the coolant level is close to the lip of the filling port. The second check we need to do is to check the engine oil level, and that can be done from the dipstick located on the right hand side of the engine looking back towards the stern of the boat. Third thing we have to do is to make sure that we turn the fuel on. The fuel stopcock is located on the left hand side of the engine looking towards the stern, and it's the one with the blue handle. Now to open the stopcock, it's shown here in the closed position. You have to lift this little collar up here and then pull the blue handle towards you, like so. To operate the marine diesel engine, we need seawater to come in and cool the engine. So the next thing we have to do is open the bilge covers down on the floor here to give us access to the seacock that allows that seawater to come in. They sort of concertina a little. So you pull this one up here, and then you get your fingers under the left-hand side one, and you open these two boards up like so. And you can see, as well as the seacock area over here, we also have access to the batteries. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, looking towards the stern of the boat, we have the raw water inlet. So this is the seacock for the raw water, and it's shown in the off position at the moment, so there's no water coming in. We need to let raw water come into the system to cool the engine. So to do that, before we leave, before we start the engine, we have to open this seacock like so. Before opening the raw water inlet, we should check the strainer. The strainer provides some filtering to the raw water system. So check the strainer to make sure it's not full of leaves or other debris. If it does need clearing, you open the strainer by turning the transparent lid and unscrewing it, empty it out of the debris, and then screw it back tight. Looking down into the bilge, we can see three objects: a cylindrical device, which is the bilge pump, and then two float switches. The bottom float switch starts and stops the bilge pump and pumps the water out. The top float switch is actuated if the bilge pump fails and the bilge starts to fill with water, and that's the bilge alarm. And if that goes off, as well as sounding an alarm, it will alert a number of people at the museum. One more thing we need to do before we start the engine, and that is to turn the batteries on. And the battery switches are located on the right side of the boat above the engine, looking back towards the stern. It's really quite simple. There are three switches. They're all normally left in the vertical position. We just have to switch them to the horizontal position. When we come back to port, we basically have to reverse a number of these steps. We have to turn off the batteries and put them in the vertical position. We have to shut the seacock to make sure raw water doesn't come in anymore, and we have to turn off the fuel valve. If there's an emergency on board, the skipper will yell, "Muster, muster, muster!" And it's the responsibility of all the crew to assemble on the deck at this point, and the skipper will give us further instructions on what to do. Fuel tank is located in the stern, just under the tiller, and here's the fuel port. Screw this. To check the fuel level, we use a dipstick, and the dipstick is located in the saloon. It's a wooden stick, and it's marked off with levels, and you can see here there's one for 40 litres. We need to make sure that we have sufficient fuel for the trip. Once we've dipped it in, we can see the fuel level on the dipstick here, and we have a marking for 40 litres and we have a marking for full. And as you can see, we've got somewhere between 40 litres and full in the fuel tank right now. There are two levers to control the engine. The front lever is the throttle, and the sternmost lever is for forward and reverse gear. To start the engine, we need to make sure the gearbox is in neutral. We apply a small amount of throttle. We turn the key clockwise about 45 degrees and hold it there for 10 to 15 seconds to initiate the glow plugs, and then we turn it a little bit further to have the engine kick over and start. So to pull up a gaff sail, you will use three lines, a peak halyard and two throat halyards, and they're all located at the base of the mast here where we're standing right now. This is the peak halyard. This is the first throat halyard, and the second throat halyard is located on the other side of the mast. On the front of the mast we have the staysail halyard and the jib halyard. Here is the staysail block. It's secured to the top of the staysail, and here is the jib block, which is secured to the top of the jib.
These are just a few of the things you need to know when coming to sail with us on the Kathleen. When you join the crew, you'll learn how to raise and trim the sails and how to tack and jibe the boat safely and effectively. It's really important to remember that the Kathleen is a working vessel that's been set up to be used by people that know what they're doing. That means there are potential hazards everywhere. Spaces to fall into, things to trip over, and objects to bump into. If you're sailing with us, always move carefully and deliberately and keep these hazards in mind. The Kathleen is based on a late 19th century design from the famous Norwegian naval architect Colin Archer. Boats like her were used all along the coast of Norway, often in treacherous conditions, to rescue other seafarers that had come to grief. Although the principles of sailing a boat like her are the same as a modern sailing boat, there are many differences. If you join the crew, you'll be helping to keep that traditional knowledge and skills alive and ensure that she's not just a display object, but a living, working vessel.
If you'd like to join us sailing on the Kathleen, we'd love to see you. All you have to do is contact the National Maritime Museum Volunteers Group, and they'll put you in touch with us.